Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is, and welcome. I'm Larry Erickson. This is the Erickson Report. We start this time with something that I haven't done. Used to do this a lot, but I haven't done it a lot recently. But even here, it's coming with a twist. So we start with some good news, but it's good news with an asterisk, because it might be good news. It hints at good news, but it will be a while before we actually know if it's good news or not. On the morning of March 4th, the Supreme Court heard oral arguments in the case of June Medical Services v. Russo. The case arises out of the attempt of the state of Louisiana to use state law to regulate abortion out of existence. This follows the path blazed by other reactionary anti-woman state governments that, having realized that they cannot ban abortion outright, try to put so many practical and legal roadblocks in the way that it's virtually impossible to get one. In this case, it's Louisiana's law that requires abortion providers to obtain admitting privileges at a hospital within no more than 30 miles of their clinic. No admitting privileges, no legal abortion services. The argument is that this requirement provides the benefits of protecting the patient's safety and health and ensuring continuity of care. Now, those arguments they're frankly straight up lies. First off, an abortion is one of the safest medical procedures there is. In fact, during oral arguments on the case, Justice Elena Kagan noted that one clinic in the court records reported serving around 70,000 women over a period of 23 years, and across that time in number had admitted only 4 patients. In fact, studies have shown that mortality rate for live childbirth is nearly 15 times that for abortion. If you give birth, you are 15 times more likely to die than if you had an abortion. What's more, in the event of an emergency, a patient who is in need of care will be admitted to whatever is the closest hospital, whether the doctor has admitting privileges there or not. Which is to the good, because getting admitting privileges is not simply a matter of making a request or filing a form. A number of hospitals will refuse to provide privileges for an abortion provider because they just oppose abortion. And a good many hospitals require doctors to admit a certain number of patients per year to get and maintain admitting privileges, which is difficult for abortion providers because they just don't admit that many people. They don't have to. As for continuity of care, nowadays that's more maintained by computer file than by physical presence. In fact, a lot of hospitals are now using what they're calling hospitalists. These are physicians who act as your primary care provider while you're in the hospital. In fact, the person you think of as your own PCP may not see you at all while you're an inpatient. There's only one reason why these restrictions exist: to force as many clinics providing abortion services as possible to close, to make it as difficult as possible, and in their minds, hopefully completely impossible, for a woman to exercise her right to this legal health procedure. But this is where it gets interesting here. Just 4 years ago, in 2016, the Supreme Court ruled in the case of a Texas law almost identical to the Louisiana one. In that case, Whole Women's Health v. Hellerstadt, the court found that the requirement of admitting privileges, in fact, provides no medical benefit at all, since abortion patients who, again, if you experience complications, they're going to take you to the nearest hospital. The court also found that the rule would force many clinics to close, which was, of course, the idea, which would impose substantial burdens on women who may need to travel hundreds of miles to find an open clinic. So you have creating burdens plus additional no benefit. The law is unconstitutional. So why are you here again? Because the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, which also upheld the Texas law, essentially ignored the Supreme Court's binding precedent to uphold the Louisiana one, by claiming not only that the requirement for admitting privileges does provide a medical benefit, but that under the Louisiana law, the closing of clinics, it didn't create as much of a burden as it did in Texas, apparently because, I don't know, Louisiana's smaller, I guess, and getting admitting privileges, they said, is easier. In short, they're saying that instead of hitting you with a big stick 5 times, Louisiana is only going to do it 4 times, so that makes it okay. So the Supreme Court is hearing a case almost identical to the one it ruled on 4 years ago. The big difference here is that Rat Kavanaugh is now on the bench, leading many abortion rights advocates to fear that the court will use the opportunity to not only uphold the Louisiana law, but to overturn Roe v. Wade. And the Fifth Circuit corruptly upheld the Louisiana law against precedent for precisely that reason. So where's the good news in any of that? Well, as I said, it's not good news, it's potential good news. And it lies in the unusual, or at least unexpected, line of questioning pursued by Chief Justice John Roberts during oral arguments. The issue, of course, is that given that it's undeniable that the law would require at least some clinics to close, the question is, what is the additional burden to women that the requirement of admitting privileges imposes versus the supposed medical benefits to those same women? Now, in 2016's Women's Health, Whole Women's Health, the High Court had ruled that there was no such medical benefit. And surprisingly, John Roberts, who dissented in Whole Women's Health, seemed to understand that this time around. For example, he asked Louisiana Solicitor General Elizabeth Murrell, quoting him, "Do you agree that the benefits inquiry under the law is going to be the same in every case, regardless of what state we're talking about? I understand the idea that the impact might be different in different places, but as far as the benefits, that's going to be the same, isn't it?" He then said to Deputy Solicitor General Jeff Wall, defending the law on behalf of the Tweety Pie administration, "I understand that the impact of the law varies from state to state, but why do you look at each state differently if the benefits of the law, they're not going to change from state to state?" Which means that it is possible, it is not unreasonable to think, or at least to hope, that John Roberts will join with the 4 more liberal justices on the court to again overturn the Fifth Circuit and declare this Louisiana law unconstitutional. Now, why Roberts, who was widely believed to be favorably disposed toward restriction abortions and even to overturning Roe v. Wade, why he'd do that is uncertain, but there are some possibilities. One, and the most devoutly to be hoped for, although it's probably the least likely, is that he is changing or has changed his mind on the matter in the last 4 years, and now that it's coming down to a question of actually outlawing abortion, he's hesitating to do it. Another is that he may be disturbed by the idea of overturning a precedent set in his own court just 4 years ago, which would seem like a slap in the face in the Roberts Court legacy sense. And John Roberts does seem rather sensitive to how the Roberts Court will be viewed by history. Yet another is that he just may be ticked off that the Fifth Circuit would simply ignore the precedent and just said, no, we're just not going to let that pass. And one more, suggested by some observers, is that the case that Louisiana presented was so sloppy and so full of deceptions and so devoid of facts and data that even if Roberts wanted to uphold the law, he couldn't justify to himself doing it on the basis of such a poor presentation. Whatever the reason, we have been give some cause to hope that even with Rat Kavanaugh on the Supreme Court, the loss of access to abortions is not a foregone conclusion. This does not mean that given another case with different circumstances that Roberts would not happily side with the reactionaries. But it does mean that despite what many of us had feared, the battle is not yet lost. And that, well, it's not good news, but at least it's a possibility of it, which is more than we usually get these days. All right, next up, something that looks like good news, but actually isn't underneath. Eric Threlkeld is a technical engineer living in Utah with his wife, Erica. His job requires him to travel a great deal, so he has a lot of airline miles built up. Keep that in mind. A little over a year ago, in December 2018, Threlkeld was shocked when Jake Ball, who he had hired as his real estate agent when he and his wife were looking for a house, when Jake Ball told him that Ball and his wife fork out $6,600 a year for insulin pens for their son, Reed. Reed has type 1 diabetes, meaning his body produces little or no insulin. There is no cure for this, and the only thing keeping 7-year-old Reed alive is the insulin delivered through a small pump attached to his abdomen. Now, knowing that prescription drugs are much cheaper in Mexico, Threlkeld offered to pick up several insulin pens during his next trip there. And he found them. It's the same brand that Reed uses. It's the same packaging. It's exactly the same stuff at slightly over 1/10 the cost. In January, Threlkeld and his wife made another trip to Mexico, this time using his days off and using his airline miles to cover the cost of the flight. Through this experience, Threlkeld and his wife learned just how great the need is. They recently started a nonprofit. It's called the Medication Foundation, and it's to help people who have been affected by skyrocketing prescription medicine costs. They ask people to donate money or airline miles in order to defray the cost of the travel. And they have the idea of having volunteers go to Mexico about every other month to buy insulin. And in fact, they're expanding because on their next trip, they're also going to be picking up some steroid inhalers for another patient being buried under the weight of prescription costs. All of which seems like a true feel-good story about caring people, seeing a need in their community, and using the resources they have to try to address it. So why is this bad news? Because why should they have to? Why should anyone have to do this? Why should anyone have to go to Mexico to leave the country in order to find life-saving medication at a price they can afford to pay? Why should anyone be financially crippled just trying to keep their child alive? Why should the cost of insulin have doubled over 4 years so that now type 1 diabetics pay on average $6,000 a year to stay alive? Why should any family have to choose between medication and the mortgage? Why should any family every month have to decide, what do we risk this month, sickness or homelessness? How is this even conscionable? Thing is, of course, it's not conscionable, which is why people like the Threlkelds do what they do. Because it's necessary, because people are suffering to satisfy the greed of the pharmaceutical industry, because it is unconscionable, and it will continue to be until and unless we make it change. All right, finally, before the break, just very quickly, this is what you could consider a footnote to that. And here we resurrect another old feature not seen in some time, which is called Everything You Need to Know, where you can learn a lot about something in a very short time. In this case, it's everything you need to know about the nature of our healthcare industry in just 2 sentences. 1, 20% of American adults, roughly 50 million people, have contributed to a crowdfunding campaign to pay for someone's medical bills or treatments. 2, just after the Democratic centrist group hug around Joe Biden, reducing the chances of a Bernie Sanders candidacy, stock prices for health insurance companies spiked. And that is everything you need to know, and we're taking a break. And we are back. On Thursday, March 5th, the state of Alabama legally murdered Nathaniel Woods, again showing that the U.S. legal system cannot be trusted to deal properly in matters of life and death. In 2005, Woods was convicted of felony murder in the killings of 3 Birmingham, Alabama police in June of 2004. There were 2 undisputed facts here. 1, Woods was present. 2, he didn't fire the shots. A man named Kelly Spencer did. Now, beyond that, of course, it gets somewhat hazy because the prosecutors are claiming that Woods masterminded the killing and actually lured police to the location. But Spencer, who admitted to being the shooter, claiming it was because he saw cops aiming their gun at him, so he was going to shoot first, a defense which, by the way, he was not allowed to raise at his trial. He said Woods was just in the wrong place at the wrong time and that he ran away when the shooting started. Now, beyond this, though, we can get back to things that are undeniable. One, it's undeniable that Woods received grossly inadequate representation, so much so that one of his attorneys simply abandoned him in the middle of the appeals process, and that Woods turned down a plea deal of 20 to 25 years in prison, at least partly because he'd been misled into believing that he couldn't be sentenced to death since he was not the shooter. It is also undeniable that two sisters of one of the slain cops openly opposed the sentence, declaring that Woods was not guilty of murder and the sentence was, in the words of one, so unjust. It is undeniable that Woods was condemned without a unanimous jury vote, which is possible only in Alabama. It is undeniable that the Appeal, a nonprofit news organization that covers the criminal justice system, found Woods to be, quoting them, actually 100% innocent. And it's also, in my opinion, undeniable that Woods was rushed to execution as punishment for his refusal to cooperate in his own official murder. See, death row inmates were told to choose by which of two methods they wanted to die. Lethal injection or the experimental method of nitrogen hypoxia, in which the person is starved of oxygen. Woods refused to make a choice, after which his execution date was scheduled ahead of some others who had been on death row longer. And by the way, among those for whom a date for execution has not even yet been set, Kerry Spencer. There is more here that I find truly offensive, such as Alabama Governor Kay Ivey's reprehensible refusal to intervene, justified later by a statement that was nothing more than an echo of the prosecution's case, along with calling Woods a known drug dealer, a crime for which, as far as I can determine, he was never convicted or even formally charged. But then again, the after-the-fact smear of a dead black man is nothing new. But ultimately, what is most offensive here is that we still pursue the death penalty, this remnant of medieval barbarity, this pay-into-blood vengeance. The death penalty, happily, hopefully, is dying out, slowly, but dying out. Last May, New Hampshire became the 21st state to abolish the death penalty. And while since 1976 there have been over 1,500 executions in the United States, just one state, Texas, accounted for 37% of that total, and just 5 states, Texas, Oklahoma, Virginia, Florida, and Missouri, accounted for nearly 2/3 of the total. And across that time, 15 other states executed no one at all. Sadly, last August, the Tweety Pie White House announced an intention to bring the Grim Reaper back to federal jurisprudence. But Representative Ayanna Pressley and Senator Dick Durbin, each in their respective chambers, are the primary sponsors of bills that would eliminate the death penalty at the federal level. While the case of Nathaniel Woods is not a federal one, obviously, it can be hoped that it still will spark others. Are you listening, Nancy Pelosi, to do something? All right, now we're going to end up the week with one of our most popular features. This is 2 weeks of stupid, clowns and outrages. And we start, as usual, with the clowns. This first one is not so much a clown as a con. And I suspect the real clowns here are the people who fall for this. But then again, I feel sorry for them, to be truthful. Anyway, Paula White, TV preacher and pastor of the City of Destiny megachurch in Apopka, Florida, and Tweety Pie's personal spiritual advisor, and yes, that's true, was preaching at the King Jesus Church Supernatural Ministry School in Miami. This is early in February, during which she told her followers that the way to God was to send her church money, the more the better, so much so they should actually skip paying their electric bill in order to do it. Because by paying that bill, you are, and I'm quoting her here, you are saying spiritually that, power company, I have now established a spiritual law that puts you first. So power company, save my family, deliver my drug-addicted son, kill this cancer in my body. I wonder if she's ever considered that if all of these people actually stopped paying their electric bill, they couldn't watch her on television. But Paula White, clown. Evil clown, but clown. Okay, next. On the March 5th edition of Chris, I'll Never Be My Dad, Cuomo's CNN show, Cuomo Primetime, Nina Turner, co-chair of Senator Bernie Sanders' presidential campaign, got into it with Hillary Rosen, a political commentator for CNN and an unofficial surrogate for Joe Biden. Turner at one point said that Sanders' platform are in the spirit of Martin Luther King, who, quoting Turner, warned us being the black community, about white moderates. She was here referencing King's famous letter from a Birmingham jail, which, if you haven't read, or even if you have, look it up. It is still an amazing document. In response, Rosen claimed, incorrectly, that King actually referred to the silence of white moderates, and subsequently told Turner that she, that is Turner, doesn't have the standing to invoke King. That caused such a reaction that Rosen apologized on Twitter. This is her apology. On air Thursday, I said my colleague Nina Turner doesn't have standing to use MLK Jr. That was wrong. I am sorry for saying those words. Please, no need to defend me and attack angry black women. They have standing. I always need to listen more than I talk. We rise together. Which required Rosen to apologize again for the racist trope, angry black women. Okay, you say something offensive and stupid enough that you have to apologize, that's not good. When you have to apologize for your apology, yet you're a clown. As a footnote, by the way, Sanders called on Joe Biden to apologize to Turner for Rosen's remarks. Discussing that with Mehdi Hassan, a columnist at The Intercept, during a show on Friday, Cuomo noted that Rosen doesn't work for the Biden campaign, she's just endorsed him. Hassan responded by saying, and quoting here, a lot of the Bernie bros who are accused of using bad language, they don't work for Bernie either, but the media and a lot of the Democratic candidates insisted that Bernie take responsibility for them, so why the double standard? Which is a good question, but when you think about it, it actually kind of answers itself. All right, the outrages, 3 outrages, all of which have to do with courts. I'll do this one first because I can do it quickly. Last month, I addressed the morally depraved decision by the Supreme Court to allow the public charge rule to go into effect while appeals against it go on. This rule is the one that allows denying green cards to potential immigrants if some official thinks that at some point in the future they might need some one of several forms of public assistance. The rule is expected to cut legal immigration by up to 2/3, and of course it will be the tired, the poor, the huddled masses who it will affect. The outrage this time is that there was a second suit related to the rule, which, because of a court stay, had resulted in the rule not being in effect in Illinois. On February 21st, the Supreme Court doubled down on its xenophobic depravity and lifted that stay, meaning the rule is now in place nationwide. And it makes me sick. Next, on February 28th, we continued our march towards centralized authoritarian rule as the Court of Appeals for Washington, D.C. agreed with the Tweety Pie gang that our courts can't force former White House counsel Don McGahn to testify before the House Judiciary Committee because lacking proof of damage to some entity beyond the federal government, quoted the decision, any dispute remains an intramural disagreement about the operations of government that we lack power to resolve. In other words, following this, for all practical purposes, the executive branch can simply refuse to provide information or testimony to Congress, even if the specific letter of the law says it must. Remember the thing about how Treasury shall provide requested tax information to congressional tax committees. But Congress cannot get any of that information or testimony that the executive doesn't feel like giving because there's no legal mechanism to force them to do it. It's a dubious position given the court system's long-standing traditional role of being the arbiter of disputes, but it does show how easy it is to let more and more power and control flow to the executive, which is not only an outrage, it's frightening. All right, last up, the big outrage this time is yet another frightening court action. The ACLU is asking the Supreme Court to take up the case of DeRay McKesson, who is being sued by a Baton Rouge cop. What happened in brief is that there were protests in the city after two white police officers shot and killed Alton Sterling, a black man, in July of 2016. Police responded, as you might expect, with riot gear, excessive force, and illegitimate arrests. At some point during one protest outside police headquarters, someone, it's not known who, threw something, it's not clear what, that hit some cop whose name is unknown. That cop sued DeRay McKesson, who was one of the organizers of the protest, on the grounds that as an organizer, he was liable for anything done by anyone present if violence was, quote, foreseeable, unquote. A district court threw out the suit, clearly as violating a core tenet of the First Amendment, which is that in the context of a protest, individuals cannot be held liable for the unintended actions of another. Then the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, same one that upheld the Texas and Louisiana abortion laws, took the case up. The court concluded that McKesson was not the person who threw the object, whatever it was, which nobody actually ever said he was. They also determined he had no control over the individual who threw it and that he had not intended for it to be thrown. Despite that, the judges concluded that McKesson could be liable for the officer's injuries and overturned the district court ruling. How? Because during the protests, McKesson, according to the cop, directed others onto the street in front of the police headquarters, which apparently violates some Louisiana law. Therefore, it was foreseeable that police would get involved, and therefore foreseeable that violence could occur, and therefore McKesson could be liable for any harm that followed. This is insane and insanely dangerous. Not only for the unreasonable but still disturbing assumption that at any time police are involved you can expect violence, but also that it literally could destroy the right of public protest by laying the risk of personal or organizational bankruptcy over any action. Quoting the ACLU, I'm going to quote them here. Under the Fifth Circuit's theory, a police officer or a counter-protester need only allege that a protest organizer directed or enabled other protesters to do any illegal thing, from overstaying a permit to pack up, to pumping the volume up a little too loud, to conducting a sit-in that obstructs the sidewalk. And countless potential plaintiffs could argue that their injuries, sprained ankles, broken windows, extreme stress, probably would not have occurred had the protest not been at that place at that time, or had police and counter-protesters not reacted as they did. With those costly risks, the ACO says, who would be willing to lead a protest? In fact, it's even worse than that, because by the Fifth Circuit's logic, the likelihood of police presence is enough to make violence foreseeable and therefore make protesters liable. But police presence at protests is routine, especially in the case of large crowds or a focus on some issue of controversy. So essentially, any organizer of any protest is running the risk of financial ruin for what some fool or agent provocateur might do, even in the absence of any illegal act. Happily, the Supreme Court dealt with this back in 1982 in NAACP v. Claiborne Hardware, making it clear that the Constitution limits the government's ability to place responsibility for violence on peaceful protesters. But it looks like this battle is going to have to be fought all over again. Since 1982, the composition of the court has changed for the worse. But at least we can hope that justices still believe in the First Amendment, because if they don't and they uphold this insanely dangerous ruling, we are all screwed. That's it. We're out of here. I will see you in 2 weeks. In the meantime, you have the best time you can, and peace.